Good evening and welcome. I am so delighted to see so many of you here tonight for this very important topic and to hear Mark Charles, to ask him questions, to learn more about who we are as a nation. I am Michelle Hirschberger, one of the members of the committee. This is a part of a lecture series that we call the Melva Kauffman Lecture Series. Melva Kauffman was a beloved teacher here at Hesston College many, many years ago and left us a legacy so that we may continue our lifelong learning. And so thank you to her family for this. I have several announcements that I would like to give, and as people are streaming in. Just to say, if you are new to this facility, the bathrooms, if you go straight back up there and then kind of toward that door, you'll see men's and women's bathrooms to the right. Note that after we have a time of questions and answers, then the community center, you go right down this main aisle and then turn slightly to the right, the doors will be open, and we have cookies and this salty M&M's mix and cappuccino and hot chocolate, and all sorts of delightful good things. So we'll kind of make this a real time of celebration. If you are interested in any of Mark Charles's books, also as we go straight back down this aisle, you'll see a place where you can purchase one or more. This lecture series will continue tomorrow with several wonderful events. Something called Formation, where students, faculty, and staff gather, will be here in this very room from 11 to 11:30, and Mark will have 29 of those minutes, and where he will speak on radical inclusivity, and we invite you to come back for that. Then if you can stay over the lunch hour, we'll immediately walk over to the Bontrager Dining Hall and do what we call here at Hesston a lunch and learn. And students, those are extra community engagement points as well, where you can sit with Mark in one of the special Souter rooms, ask him questions while you're having your lunch. A super special event happens tomorrow evening at 7:30. In the community center, which is the same place where we'll have our cookies and drinks tonight, we will do a simulation called Loss of Turtle Island. You'll be assigned a role, and we will play this game that is based on historical facts, where we will try to live out, including living the emotions of what it might mean to see someone steal your land, to have treaties broken, to have one thing after another happen to you. What does it mean like to be one of those peoples doing that injustice? What does it mean like to be an indigenous person? So that's called Loss of Turtle Island. We welcome all of you. We can play this game with 300 people. So come on down tomorrow night. We will have, I'm looking at my notes here to make sure I've got everything right. This event tonight is also worth community engagement points for our students, and we'll take attendance at the end of the plenary and Q&A session. And we'll have that, and again, be dismissed and get to have some wonderful cookies. Finally, I want to say a very special welcome to several people groups who are live streaming tonight. We've made a special invitation for many of the First Nations of Oklahoma and Kansas to join us. Many of them said yes because of fear of ICE tonight. They're live streaming in, and we want to say welcome. Welcome to everyone who's live streaming. We are very glad that you are here with us. So now let me introduce to you Mark Charles. Mark Charles is a Navajo, Native American activist, public speaker, journalist, blogger, computer programmer, Reformed pastor, and very good theologian. He also has some incredibly great stories if you happen to ever have a chance to have supper with him at a Mexican restaurant, which I just did tonight. He's written several books and is working on another one, which I'll be excited to get. In his book, Unsettling Truths, which maybe many of you are familiar with, he helps us unpack the doctrine of discovery and how that, and I'm a theologian, so I do get to say this, bad theology justified the genocide of Native Americans and other atrocities. Mark Charles was also an independent candidate for President of the United States in the 2020 election. That's kind of a wild, wonderful story, too. And he is here tonight to help us understand and create a common memory of who we really are. So please help me warmly welcome Mark Charles.
Yat-e. Yat-e. Mark Charles, Yinishya. Sinbake dene nishle, doto higlini vashischin. Sinbake dene dashiche, doto cheatni dashinella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sinbake dene nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dene. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toduchitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I want to acknowledge tonight that we are on the lands of the Kaw, the Kiowa, the Osage, the Wichita, the Comanche, the Ochete-Succowan, and the Ute people. I want to acknowledge these people as the hosts of these lands, the indigenous hosts of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be walking on these lands with you today. These are the nations that they were living here, they were hunting here, they were farming here, they were fishing here, they were raising their families here and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And many of them are still here. And we can't forget that. And that's a lot about what this evening tonight is about. We want to create common memory so that we don't forget our history and understand who we are and where we came from and why we did the things that we did. Now, I need to warn you, in the next hour and 15 minutes, I can almost guarantee I'm going to offend everyone in the room. I'm going to say something, I'm going to reference something, I'm going to debunk a hero that you had, I'm going to hit a political nerve, I'm going to cross the theological line, I'm going to do something that's going to offend you. At some point, you're going to want to stand up and throw something at me. Another point, you may want to just walk out. I encourage you, exist both of those temptations. Stay engaged, stay connected. We're going to get through this. But there's a lot of things we have to talk about. At different points, you may feel like I'm picking on you and your neighbor's getting off scot-free. Well, don't worry. I have a bipartisan critique. Whether you're liberal or conservative, left-leaning or right-leaning, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I will offend everybody here. So we're all going to feel the same pinch at some point or another. So if you think I'm picking on your neighbor, on you more than your neighbor, just sit tight for a few minutes and we'll get everyone feeling the prick. But the reason I want to do this is because we need to talk about our history. One of the goals of what I want to do, and the title of our event tonight, well, let me start by saying this. On this QR code is a link to a bunch of resources I put up online. I have a TEDx talk that I've done lectures that I've done, articles that I've written. At the end of this session, we're going to have a Q&A session. And I could pretty much tell you the questions you're going to ask me right now. Because what I'm going to say is going to be so shocking to you, I can pretty much guess what questions you're going to come back at me with. And I know what questions you're going to have tomorrow. I know what other questions you're going to have in a week or 2 weeks. So I've tried to allocate for that. One of the things that I do is I run a Patreon site. And on my Patreon site, every month I have a tier where we have a monthly Q&A. And so this way, not only can you ask the questions that'll be burning in your heart tonight, but if a month later or 2 months later, or even 3 months or even 6 months later, something is still in your mind and you're trying to sort through it, you can jump onto my Patreon, you can subscribe even just for 1 month, and you can get into that Q&A and ask your question and find a way to further engage with me. At the end of the session, we'll have some of my books for sale. I do 2 things. I sell signed copies of the book. They're $20. That includes tax, so technically they're $18.43 and $1.57 in Kansas sales tax. You guys have some high tax here. But I also do what's called my book study special, where if you have a church group or a youth group or someone who wants to study this book together and you buy a 10-pack of my books from me, I will give you a free virtual Q&A. Within a year up to after you purchase the books. You can schedule that with my assistant. I'll jump on a Zoom call with your study, and we'll have a Q&A there to talk about what you're going through in the book. So those are some of the things that we're going to want to talk about. But what we're working on is called common memory. And for some reason, can you put my computer up on the ledge there? I think my Bluetooth is trying to hide from me at the moment. Let me see. Sorry about this. It didn't fall asleep. No, it didn't fall asleep. Let me try this one more time. I apologize for this. We tested this beforehand. Let me connect it. Let me see if I can get this connected. If not, we're going to have to do this manually, which will be harder. Hold on just a second. Shoot. I apologize for that, everybody. So one of the things that we're going to talk tonight is creating common memory. Common memory is something that our nation is terrified of. If you don't believe me, just look at the backlash we have to critical race theory. Critical race theory is the history as told from the margins. We all know that the victors write the history. If you win a war, you get to write about the war. One of the challenges we face as a nation is that as a country, we've never lost a war that matters. We've won every major military conflict we've ever been involved in. Technically, the Korean War is not over yet. We pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We got some hurt pride, but we didn't lose any land. We've never lost a war that matters. As a result, white men have been able to write their own history for 250 years. And they've created a mythology. And so when the voices from the margins begin to tell their side of the story, that's terrifying because it causes their house of cards to begin to crumble. And so there is a quote used by a native elder, and now this is not working again. There we go. George Erasmus, and he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And he used this quote. He said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. So as I'm saying things that are going to be offensive, as I'm saying things that are going to be challenging, as I'm saying things that are going to be new, I'm not trying to cancel anybody. I'm not trying to shame anybody. I'm trying to create a common memory so that we can all agree with what we did as a nation, what we're standing on. Not so we can just remove the people at the top and replace them with the people from the bottom, but so we can all see one another as peers, so that for the first time in our nation's history, we can have a healthier community. That's the goal that I'm working for with all of this tonight. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this history. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. This papal bull, along with others written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They did not see them as human. This is the same doctrine that allowed Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in this new world and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of the book I co-authored says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your car keys, your cell phones, your laptops out. I will come by and discover them for you. Right? Clearly, this is not discovery. You can colonize those lands, you can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview informs you that the people living there are not fully human. So this makes the doctrine of discovery a white, male, Christian supremacist doctrine that is the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but in chapters 3 and 4 of this book, we talk about how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your neighbor and pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine that says you can kill people who don't look like, sound like, act like, eat like, or worship like you. We don't have time to go into that journey tonight, but it's a fascinating journey that helps you understand a lot of things about the church, especially in the United States of America today. And so this doctrine of discovery, the challenge with this doctrine is the way it has infected this nation all the way down to our foundations. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonies, the 13 colonies that are here, that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset these colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used that inclusive term, all men, is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically racist, white supremacist, and sexist, right? It says men, not women, document. Now, a few years later, the Founding Fathers wrote another document. They began this one. Again, sounds inclusive. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Of course, this is the preamble to the Constitution. But if you keep reading the Constitution, not even much further, just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the part of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of this union, who is and who is not protected by this document. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you have to note is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire document, preamble all the way down to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. Now, maybe we're saying, Mr. Charles, this is the Old English. The Old English use he to refer to everybody. Yes, do you know why they use he to refer to everybody? Because they were sexist. Right? Women couldn't own property. They couldn't vote. They weren't seen as full participants in society. They were absolutely sexist. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, if you go back to 1776, you take out women, you take out natives, and you take out African people, you know who's left? White men. And technically, to vote, you had to be a landowner. You see, we don't think about this frequently enough. The reason our Constitution was written, the purpose of the document was to protect the interests of white landowning men. Right? So we act surprised today that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. We act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This isn't surprising. Our Constitution's working. People get upset that, right, in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United, rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs. There are unlimited contributions to candidates. Well, this isn't surprising. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. And maybe we think, well, Mr. Charles, we corrected that. We fixed those things. Well, we tried, right? Many people think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. But many people have also not read the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, what it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted shall exist. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. In 2024, slavery is 100% legal in our Constitution, protected under the criminal justice system. Slavery is legal here. We never abolished it. We redefined and codified it. So we have to acknowledge our Constitution is a systemically racist, sexist, and white supremacist document. Now, in 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two white men litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one claimed to have gotten the same land from the government, and they want to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. They had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. Did the native nation have the right to sell the land, or did the government have the right? This is the John Marshall Court. John Marshall is considered one of the greatest U.S. Supreme jurists in U.S. history. In their opinion, what they wrote is that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made. And that title was consummated by possession. Now, because this might actually imply that native nations had some sense of sovereignty to the land, they went on to clarify their thinking and said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Essentially what they said is that natives, we are occupants of this land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies occupies air, and white people, Europeans, they are the discoverers of this land. They are fully human. Therefore, they have the fee title to the land. Therefore, they are sovereign over the land. This case in 1823 helps create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery is referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, in 1985, and most recently in 2005. I have a TEDx talk going into some of these cases. It's called We the People, the 3 Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. You can Google it. I want to talk for a moment about the 2005 case. In the 1770s, the United Indian Nation occupied about 6 million acres of land in what is now Central State New York. The George Washington administration reduced that land to a few 100,000 acres, and then they passed a law saying this land was only reserved for the Oneida and that only the federal government could purchase those lands. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase those lands until they were all bought up and the Oneida were moved out to the Midwest. In the 1990s, the Oneida Indian Nation came back and they bought some of their traditional lands on the open market. They paid full price for them. And they wanted to reestablish their sovereignty over them. And so they refused to pay taxes on them. The lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill, and the city of Sherrill wanted their tax revenue, so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The court ruled in favor of the Oneida, so they appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and that decision was upheld, so they appealed a second time to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took the case, they heard it in 2004, and they released their opinion in 2005. In their opinion, they reversed the decision of the lower courts. In the first footnote of the case where they're referencing precedent, they reference by name the doctrine of discovery. They go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the state of New York, and the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They go on to reference another case that says it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement. Again, that's white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They then go on in 2005 to argue, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneida sold them 200 years ago. It was not until lately that the Oneida sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of a city like Sherrill. Now, if that argument sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's almost the exact same argument that John Marshall made back in 1823. It doesn't use the word savages, but it says, we took your lands, we civilized them, something you couldn't do, and now we can't go back. So they conclude in 2005 that we reject the unification theory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the United States, and we hold that standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, doctrine of discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now this is shocking because, right, she is a voice of dissent, or was a voice of dissent on an increasingly conservative Supreme Court. She was fighting for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because land titles, the title to your church, the title to your house, the title to your business, the title to your school, because land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, we're savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, upheld by both the left and the right, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg clearly demonstrated. So the United States Supreme Court is a systemically racist and white supremacist court that to this day has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. I want to go back a few years, back to 1630. In 1630, John Winthrop was in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was with a group of colonists here to plant the Boston colony. He was on board a ship and he preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the colonists that he was with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he told his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on in the sermon to exhort his congregation in all meekness, gentleness, patience, liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. End of a sermon, he does what most pastors do in their sermons, which is in order to compel his congregants to heed his exhortations, he quoted from the Old Testament of the Bible. And John Winthrop decided to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to take possession of their promised lands, and God is reiterating the threats and promises of their land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things for me. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. It says there that, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes the word river to vast sea. Now, why does he do this? Well, he didn't cross a river, right? He crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the shores of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who's read the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua? How does God tell his people to take possession of their promised lands? In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says, however, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving to you as inheritance. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them as the Lord your God has commanded you. Promised lands for one group of people is literally God-ordained genocide for another group of people. So now that we have a racist, sexist, and white supremacist doctrine of discovery, a racist, sexist, and white supremacist Declaration of Independence, a racist, sexist, and white supremacist Constitution, a racist, sexist, and white supremacist Supreme Court, and God's permission to commit genocide, now we have to talk about our history. So I call this sermon, John Winthrop's sermon, the birth of American exceptionalism. Now, American exceptionalism doesn't just mean Americans are better at things than other people. It means we have a unique relationship with God than other nations have. And so this idea of promised land theology percolates for about 100 years. This is 1630. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. We go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's this growth in churches, a renewal within denominations. Early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. The belief that this God-ordained nation has the right to rule Turtle Island from sea to shining sea. Now, there is a lot of history I could point to at this point to help you understand the impact of manifest destiny. I could give you stats, I could tell you stories, I could wrench your gut. And I could get a response from you. But it wouldn't grab you. It wouldn't sicken you. At least not as much as it needs to. So I want to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes hopefully making you sick with what we did regarding Manifest Destiny. I want to go back to the adage that says the victors write the history, right? No one usually refutes this, right? If you win a war, you get to write about the war. As I already said, the United States of America never lost a war that matters. As a result, the white men of this nation have written their own history for 250 years. What happens when you do that? Well, let me tell you a story about two men, Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. Though both were born in the early 1900s, they both fought in World War II. Oscar Groening was German and fought in the Nazi army. Robert McNamara was American and he fought in the U.S. Army. Oscar Groening was an accountant and he was stationed at Auschwitz. He wasn't gassing people, he wasn't guarding people, he wasn't shooting people. He was counting things. When they brought the Jewish people into the camp, on board the trains, they took all their possessions from them, they put them in the room, and Oscar Groening's job was to go through the room and make an assessment of the value of that property, write it down on a paper, and pass it up the chain of command. That was his job. He knew what was going on there. He saw some of it with his own eyes. He wasn't doing it, but it sickened him, and he frequently requested the transfer. He was left stationed there for a few years, I think, and finally towards the end of the war, he was transferred out and he was moved to the front lines. He was captured, and when the war ended, he was in a prison camp. So after the war, he went quietly back to Germany and lived his life. In the late 20th century, there was a Holocaust denier movement that was sweeping through Germany and other parts of the world. And he was appalled at the things his countrymen were denying that they had done. And so he began to talk publicly about his experience at Auschwitz, what he saw, what he observed there. After one such interview that he gave on the BBC, a very public interview, he was arrested and he was charged with complicity to the murder of 300,000 Jewish people. He went before a judge and he said to the judge, I am absolutely complicit. I was a part of this machine that did these horrific things, and I was absolutely a part of that machine. I am complicit in this. Now, am I guilty of murder? He said, that's for you to decide. So they went through the trial and he was found guilty. And he appealed. And during the appeal process, he died. He was a very old man. And he died a condemned war criminal. 5 years apart from him, in 1916, Robert McNamara was born in California. He also served in World War II. He also worked with numbers. He was an analyst. He served under General LeMay in the Pacific Theater of what was now called the Air Force. And his job was to analyze the bombing raids that we were doing over Japan and other parts of the South Pacific. And as he analyzed our bombing raids, he realized we were flying our bombers too high and they were missing their targets. And so he recommended we fly our bombers lower. Now, General LeMay was planning a bombing raid. It was called Operation Meeting House. It was the deadliest bombing raid in the history of the world. It was worse than Nagasaki, worse than Hiroshima. It was the incendiary firebombing of Tokyo. And in a single night, 100,000 Japanese civilians were burned to death. We chose Tokyo for that bombing raid because we knew it was made out of wood and it would burn hotter. And it was so effective that LeMay used McNamara's recommendations for the rest of the war, including the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And all told, over 300,000 Japanese civilians died in these bombing raids. At the end of the war, Robert McNamara was given the Legion of Merit, which is a very distinguished award for military service. And he was almost immediately tapped by John F. Kennedy to serve as the Secretary of Defense. when he ran. He was the Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. He was one of the architects of the Vietnam War, including the use of Agent Orange. At the end of his service as Secretary of Defense, he was given the Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian medal you can get in the United States of America. Towards the end of his life, Robert McNamara was reflecting on what he had been involved in. He was recording a documentary called The Fog of War. And in his documentary, this is what he said: the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with the rules of war. Was there a rule that said you shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a single night? LeMay said if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. So what's the difference between Robert McNamara and Oscar Groening? Was one person good, the other person evil? Was one person right, was one person wrong? What's the difference between Robert McNamara and Oscar Groening? It's whose side they fought on, right? Robert McNamara's side won, so he died a war hero. Oscar Groening's side lost, so he died a war criminal. That is the only difference. They both were complicit. Actually, Robert McNamara was complicit in more deaths than Oscar Groening was. In World War II, they were both complicit in at least 300,000 deaths. The only difference between these two men is one side won and the other side lost. And that's what happens when the victors write the history. The hardest chapters to read in this book are chapters 9 and 10, where we deal with this adage. These are the two hardest chapters to read in this book. But it's not the adage that makes it hard. What makes it hard is we take that adage and that example I just gave you of Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara, and we apply it to this man. This man, most people consider to be the greatest president in U.S. history. Most people believe this man to be the greatest president in U.S. history. But again, we've never lost a war that matters. What that means, we actually don't have a clue who Abraham Lincoln was. We know very little about him. Let me demonstrate that for you. Let me show you. I want to introduce you to Lincoln the same way he introduced himself to the nation when he ran for Senate in 1758. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it was already known about Lincoln that he was against chattel slavery. People knew that. But they wanted to know how he felt about race. And so in the debates, this is how he introduced himself to the country. He said, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now, why would he introduce himself this way? Well, think back to the 2022 midterm elections, right? Just prior to that election, there was a major Supreme Court case in our country, right, where the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Because of that, every candidate who ran in 2022 had to take a side on Roe versus Wade. Right? They had to take a side on Roe versus Wade. Well, prior to the 1858 election, the U.S. Supreme Court also had another landmark case. This was called the Dred Scott decision. This is the case that determined black people weren't covered by our founding documents. And so in the midterm elections of 1858, every candidate had to take their position on Dred Scott. And Abraham Lincoln made it very, very clear that he was in favor of Dred Scott. Again, he was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now, he lost that election in 1858 for the Senate, but he went on to run for president in 1860, and he won that election. And on the morning of his inauguration, the Senate was deeply concerned. Several states had already threatened to secede from the Union, and they were trying desperately to figure out what can they do to hold this nation together. And so in the early morning hours of Lincoln's inauguration, they passed what's called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protects slavery in states where it already exists. What it says is no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to service. The Corwin Amendment constitutionally protects slavery in states where it already exists. In his inauguration address, Abraham Lincoln had to address race. And so he said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states, this is in his address, that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and has been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all of the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that, and he just begins quoting himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He goes on to address the Corwin Amendment. And he says, I understand or propose amendment to the Constitution to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service, to avoid misconstruction of what I have said, holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So he is absolutely in favor of constitutionally protecting slavery in states where it already exists. Now, even though the president doesn't play a role in amending the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln took it upon himself to mail this amendment out to every governor, asking for them to pass it. It didn't get passed, and so it never became an amendment, but it was a gallant effort. In 1862, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, wrote a scathing op-ed. He was calling for the immediate emancipation of enslaved peoples. This was one of Lincoln's campaign promises. Now, Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. And he was afraid to release it, though, because there were 4 states that had not seceded from the Union that still allowed enslavement. And he was concerned about the political fallout of the slave owners within those states if he released the Emancipation Proclamation. And those were the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So instead of releasing the proclamation, he instead wrote a letter. And in his letter, he wrote that my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. And it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So Abraham Lincoln's response to the slave owners in those 4 states was to assure them that he didn't give a crap about black lives. He was doing this to save the Union. A few months later, January of 1863, he finally did release the Emancipation Proclamation. If you read where it emancipates enslaved peoples, it's very specific. They're freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Missing from that list is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And the enslaved peoples in those states don't get their freedom until after Abraham Lincoln's assassinated in 1865. And he knew what he was doing, because in the Emancipation Proclamation it says, accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this amendment were not given, or this proclamation were not issued. He knew what he was doing. Now, the capstone of Abraham Lincoln's legacy is the 13th Amendment. Again, most Americans think the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. We've never read the thing, but that's what we think it says. If you want to understand the 13th Amendment, you have to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And none of us want to read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, again, the amendment, we think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the country. That's not what it says. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln is asked, does the Declaration of Independence apply to black people? And his response was, I think the authors of that noble instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. He was also asked about making citizens of black people. He says, Judge Douglas has said to you that he has not been able to give me an answer to the question whether I am in favor of Negro citizenship. I tell him very frankly, I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. It's my opinion that the different states have the power to make a Negro citizen under the Constitution of the U.S. if they chose, but if the state of Illinois had that power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it. So as president, Abraham Lincoln had a dilemma. He wanted to end chattel slavery, not because he cared about black lives, but because he wanted to save the Union. But he didn't want to make voters or jurors of Negroes or allow them to hold office or to intermarry. He didn't want them to be a part of society. So he debated everything. Does he send them back to Africa? What does he do? Well, his solution was to put a clause in the 13th Amendment. And let's keep enslavement legal in our criminal justice system. That way, a white judge, a white jury, a white law enforcement officer, on a whim, can remove the civil rights of a person of color and be completely constitutionally protected in doing so. He gave us the tools we are using today to marginalize people of color. If you want to know why the United States of America has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and why we incarcerate people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate we incarcerate white people, it's because this was the vision of Abraham Lincoln. This was his solution of what do you do with enslaved people so you don't want them to be a full part of society, but you don't want to keep slavery legal, or chattel slavery legal. What we're living in right now is Abraham Lincoln's vision. So again, we just have to acknowledge today slavery is 100% legal, and we're using this tool to keep our people of color marginalized. Again, Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. But we knew this, right? We knew this. Who's been to the Lincoln Memorial? Raise your hand. Keep them up. Who's been to the museum at the base of the memorial? There's a small museum at the base of the memorial. It's off to the left. It's right by the bathroom. It's about the size of a large classroom, about a quarter the size of this room. On each wall, there's plaques with different quotes by Abraham Lincoln, hanging in marble, etched in the stone, about different parts of his legacy. On one wall is this 5 plaques with his thoughts on the Union. Middle of that wall is this plaque that says, I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is not either to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. There is a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally says, according to Abraham Lincoln, black lives don't matter. We're not lamenting that. We're not bemoaning that. We're not grieving that. We are celebrating that. Look at how much this man loved the Union. We are celebrating him for how much he loved the Union, that he didn't give a crap about black lives. And it gets worse. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed two bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to anyone willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. This was the spring and summer of 1862. In the fall of 1862, after the Dakota War of 1862, which was very, very bloody and had a lot of casualties on both sides, and at the end of the war, half the Dakota warriors fled north into Canada, the other half surrendered. Those who surrendered were immediately put into military tribunals, and they were now being tried by the very people they were just fighting. The trials were in a language they didn't understand. The trials shared witnesses. They lasted just a few minutes each. They were by any measure a legal sham. And at the end of these trials, hundreds, 400 to 500 of these Dakota warriors were found guilty and condemned to death. The order went all the way up to Lincoln. No one wanted to execute that order. Even Lincoln couldn't bring himself to do it. But instead of ordering retrials, he simply changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 of the Dakota warriors were going to die. And now he was afraid of what was already happening, which was the settlers in Minnesota were going to rise up and take things into their own hands, which they were starting to do. So again, for a second time, he didn't order retrials. He changed the criteria again of what warranted a death sentence. And now he landed on the magic number of 38. So the day after Christmas, 1862, hundreds of people came out and watched as the largest mass execution in the history of our country happened with the hanging of the Dakota 38. January 29 of 1863, I want to read this for you. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine. In the frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Sagwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, or Big River, in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from the hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The Army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or to freeze. This is actually one of the worst massacres in the history of our nation, and almost nobody knows anything about it. A friend of mine, Darren Perry, a former leader of the Shoshone Nation, has written this book called Bear River Massacre, Shoshone History. He is doing everything he can to educate our nation about this massacre. It's been buried. No one knows anything about it. Actually, next week I'm traveling to Idaho, where they're going to be memorializing this massacre on January 29 again, and I'm going to join him there in remembering that massacre. In February of 1863, just 1 month after the massacre, Abraham Lincoln nullified the treaty of all the tribes in Minnesota. This is in response to the Dakota War of 1862. In March of 1863, with no treaties in place and no new negotiations, Abraham Lincoln ordered the removal of all the native nations from Minnesota. They were put on barges, they were put on wagons, they were marched out of the state into the Dakota territories. It was a very violent and oppressive removal. They were put on lands that wasn't sustainable for them. In the fall of 1863, one of Abraham Lincoln's generals gave this order, General Carleton. Henceforth, every Navajo, this is my people, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There can be no other talk on this subject. His army captains went through my people's land. They burned our hogans. They slaughtered our livestock. They destroyed our crops. They hunted our people throughout our land. Nearly 10,000 of my Navajo people were rounded up and forcibly marched down to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of our people died of exposure and starvation along the way. In the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, D. Brown recorded that it was a wretched place, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds. To shelter themselves from the rain and sun, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground and cover and line them with mats of woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. Crowded together as they were, disease had begun to take a toll on the weaker ones. It was a bad place. And although escape was difficult and dangerous under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. A quarter of my people died in prison. They called this a reservation, but it wasn't a reservation. It was a death camp. A death camp that was proved by Abraham Lincoln himself. In the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This doubled the land and the resources available to the railways to complete the Transcontinental Railway, and it gave them the mineral rights to the ground to incentivize them to build it faster. In the fall of 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty grounds in eastern Colorado. They were waving a white flag of surrender to show they were there peacefully, and they were waving an American flag. And the U.S. Army, led by a Methodist pastor, came over the hill, and he ordered all of them slaughtered. The men were out hunting. It was women and children and elders in the camp. Hundreds of them were put to death. And that night, the soldiers, in celebration of the massacre, paraded the genitalia of the Cheyenne and Arapaho down the streets of Denver. A week after this massacre, on December 6 of 1864, Abraham Lincoln in his annual address stated that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law, and that the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines had been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. What made him so confident? Why was he so sure that now that this last massacre had occurred, that we were going to complete the Transcontinental Railway? Over the 4 years of his presidency, the last 2 years, he had the Dakota 38 removed, he had the Bear River Massacre, he had the Long Walk to Navajo, and the Sand Creek Massacre. It helps if you look at it on a map. This is a map of the U.S. with the early route to the railway. There was a northern route that went from Duluth, Minnesota, through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and comes out near Seattle. There's a central route that had made it to Omaha, Nebraska. It had to go through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and came out near San Francisco. And there was a northern route that went through the northern territories of New Mexico and Arizona and came out near Los Angeles. If you put those massacres on the route, after the removal of the Winnebago and Dakota from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre in southern Idaho and northern Utah, after the Long Walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the Four Corners area, and after the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln had essentially ethnically cleansed the three routes of the railway. See, not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. In fact, Hitler got many of his ideas from Lincoln. If you go to Washington, D.C., the grandest of all of the monuments in D.C. is the Lincoln Memorial. It's no surprise that it's modeled after a Greek temple. Why? Because if we make war heroes out of general soldiers like Robert McNamara, who are complicit in these genocides, we make gods out of presidents. And it wasn't just Lincoln. The entire 19th century is covered with this. This is a chart I made, 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is the year I found our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict. Every year in red is every year we were fighting against native nations. You can see from 1815 to 1886, we had almost 75 straight years of war, of warfare against native peoples. This is the battles we fought primarily during the 19th century. In 1840, this is what our country looked like. If you go online, you can look up Congressional Medals of Honor by war and by conflict. And if you look up Medals of Honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor to the U.S. soldiers who fought in the Indian War campaigns. At the end of that period, this is what the nation looked like. We had completed our manifest destiny. During that century, the majority population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population collapsed from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's higher than the rate of genocide Hitler had over the Jews in World War II. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the U.S. Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And it's even worse if you look at all the way back to discovery. In the 1500s, the world population was 480 million. In 1900, it was 1.6 billion. That's a 3.39% rate of growth. Europe went from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65 rate of growth. Even with the horrors of the slave trade, Africa went from 63 million to 123 million for a 1.782 rate of growth. North America went from 0 people, right, because we were savages, to 76.2 million. That's all the white people that came in. Turtle Island, the native population, a very conservative estimate of the continental United States in 1500 was 6 million people. The low in 1870 was 237,000. That's a 0.0395% rate of growth, which is a rate of death of 96.05%. And we knew what we were doing. In 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, was giving his State of the State address, and this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying war's broken out and we can't, or he's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has struck and we can't feed these people. He's literally saying we can't stop killing them until they're exterminated. And this is perfectly in line with Promised Land theology, right? In Joshua 10, it says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes. Together with all their kings, he left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Again, you're thinking, Mr. Charles, Promised Land theology, we don't think that way anymore. In 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu was in the United States. He spoke to a joint session of Congress. He was lobbying against a nuclear deal that President Obama was negotiating with Iran. He was speaking to a very partisan, a very divided Congress, and he had to get everyone on the same page as him. And so early in his speech, he chose one of the most unifying themes in U.S. politics, which is the theme of American exceptionalism. And he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. If you want to know why our Congress has an almost bipartisan, unanimous support for Israel, It's because we have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has nothing to do with freedom or equality. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised land to justify what we did to Native peoples and African people. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's about justifying oppression and, in our case, even genocide. So let's talk about today. Right? White Christian nationalism is the theme that we're trying to discuss today as a nation. But we're not equipped to have this conversation. First of all, we have a very simplistic two-party system that changes every dialogue binary. And second, we get our news through algorithms and news bubbles. We've all heard of the Fox News bubble. There's also a CNN, MSNBC news bubble. They're both toxic. They're both meant to keep a certain party in power. They're both there to make you angry and make you afraid. Your algorithms on all your social media is doing the exact same thing to the younger people. I want to think back to 2015, or to 2020. After the public lynching of George Floyd, there was a lot of upheaval in our nation. There were protests going on. In Washington, D.C., at Lafayette Park, right outside the White House, there was a protest going on almost every day. In June 1st of 2020, law enforcement went out early that morning and they aggressively cleared that park. After it was empty for a few hours, after a little while, President Trump walked out of the White House, walked through the park, and walked up to the church across the street. He stood there, took his Bible, held it upside down at first, then turned it around, held it right side up, took a picture, said almost nothing, and then walked back. He was immediately called out for exactly what he was doing, which was he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists. And he was called out for what he was doing. It was very clear and it was very quick. And this image is etched in the brains of every U.S. citizen right now. We've seen it a number of times on media. In 2020, President Biden was also running for president, and he was trying to be the antithesis of Trump. He said that if he was elected, he would bring statesmanship back to the White House. He said if he was elected, he would not do his diplomacy over Twitter. He would speak with a more complex sentence structure. Right? He said he would bring statesmanship back into the White House. And just after he got inaugurated, he had a test, because there was a terrorist attack on a U.S. base in Afghanistan. It was very bloody and many people were killed. It was so bad that he had to give a public address. And so on August 26th of 2021, President Biden addressed the nation. In his address, he said, "To those who have carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command." Now, just about a year ago, Vladimir Putin said something very similar about the war in Ukraine. He said the war in Ukraine breached the borders of Russia. He would defend his nation with every measure at his command, and U.S. citizens went up in arms. How dare you talk that way? You're a nuclear power. How dare you speak that way? That's irresponsible, even though our presidents on both the left and the right speak that way every day. President Biden went on in his speech. He said, "I want to thank the Secretary of the Defense and the military leadership for their unanimous work on this." And then he said, "Those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah, when the Lord says, 'Whom shall I send and who shall go for us?' And the American military has been answering for a long time, 'Here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me.'" In his State of the Union a couple of years ago, President Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol. This was a sacred space to hold this speech. He also used it in reference to our sacred obligation to care for our military veterans. Now, I absolutely agree we have a moral obligation to do everything we can to care for those who fight wars on our behalf. But he used the word sacred. Why did he bring the divine into this dialogue about our military? Because President Biden believes the U.S. military is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. If you think white Christian nationalism is a partisan problem, you're living in a news bubble. CNN's not going to tell you this, right? It's going to destroy their advertising. Fox News doesn't have the theological acumen to tell you this. They don't know what's going on. Right? But we have to recognize that we as a nation, white Christian nationalism is written into our foundations. It's who we are as a nation. This is not a partisan problem. This is who we are, and until we wrestle with that, we're never going to be able to fix it. I believe the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada, but I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation. Why? Because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. And that's not true. We use the term racial reconciliation all the time. Racial reconciliation is a misnomer. We are not reconciling something. Race is a human construct. It was constructed for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. There is no racial reconciliation. We don't need to reconcile this relationship. We need to reconcile this relationship for the very first time. We need to mediate this dispute for the very first time. So I talk about our need for truth and conciliation, not reconciliation. And I'm so convinced we need this. That's why I ran for president in 2020. That was my vision, was to start this dialogue. Now I want to take 5 minutes to talk to you briefly about why we have such a hard time talking about this history. Why is this so hard for us? Why do we squirm in our seats? Why do we not know this history? What is our block? It's because we don't understand trauma. When I say trauma, most of you immediately think of what's called PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress or a post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a condition you get when you experience a horrifying event. It's an individual diagnosis. It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally. It's this all-encompassing condition. It's an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a single horrifying event. There's another trauma called a complex PTSD. A complex PTSD is just like a PTSD, except a complex PTSD doesn't come from a single event, it comes from a series of events. So if you get PTSD from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. If you get PTSD from being in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. Psychologists have observed that a complex PTSD is passed down from one generation to the next. They see the symptoms in the children and grandchildren of the people who experience the trauma. Now there's another diagnosis called HTR. HTR, or historical trauma, is not an individual diagnosis. It's how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. It was first observed in Native communities after our history of residential schools and boarding schools. You can also see it in African American communities after enslavement, or Jim Crow, or segregation, or mass incarceration. You can see it in Japanese American communities after internment camps. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. Does that make sense? Now, understanding this is helpful because when I give lectures or speeches or go out and write to talk about these things, I can understand the trauma of the people of color who are in the room and make sure I use my words in a way that is sympathetic or at least not triggering to the people who have that condition. But one of the most disruptive demographics in dialogues on race is not people of color. Do you know who it is? It's white people. White people are one of the most disruptive demographics when it comes to dialogue about race. And a few years ago, I ran across some research by a psychologist named Rachel McNair. And Rachel McNair was studying what she calls the psychology of killing. What she wanted to know is if society gives you the right to take a life. You're a soldier, you're a drone pilot, you're in certain parts of the medical field, even if you're just a good guy at the mall with a gun, and society gives you the right to take a life. She wanted to know, what does that do to you? She found that it causes what she called a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. PITS. A perpetration-induced traumatic stress has all the symptomatology of a PTSD, but PITS doesn't afflict the victim of the horrifying event. It afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused it. Once I found her research, I could make a hypothesis, which is if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which we call historical trauma, which afflicts communities of color, might not PITS also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which is impacting white America? Why? Because you cannot build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourselves. And so I engage with and prepare for my white audiences as another group of traumatized people. The first symptom of trauma is shock and denial. Why haven't you heard this history before? Because you are in a state of shock and denial. You don't want to know it. We know the Lincoln-Douglas debate says bad things about Lincoln. We don't want to hear it, so we don't read them. We know history from the margins is healthy and a good counterbalance to the victors write the history, but we're terrified of that, so we condemn and demonize critical race theory. These are triggered, traumatic responses that white people are having to hearing the other side of the coin. And this is why we need to create this common memory. This is why we need to talk about this history. This is why we need to have this national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's not to cancel people. It's not to shame people. It's so that we can talk through this history, come to a term and understanding of it, and find a way to build a healthy community moving forward. This is what we have to do. We need this type of work. We need to feel this type of uncomfortability because we as a nation, my brothers and sisters, have done some absolutely horrible, horrific things. In the name of our God, we've done these things. And we've justified it. And it's killing us inside. And if we don't find a way to talk about it, if we don't find a way to acknowledge it, it is going to destroy us. So I'm very grateful that you came out tonight with me to hear this lecture and to begin to build this common memory. I'm so grateful that, in the words of George Erasmus, we can work together to create this common memory so that for the first time in our nation's history, we might actually have a healthy community. I want to thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank you for taking some time out of your busy weeks and your busy weekends. I want to thank you for not getting up and walking out. I want to thank you for not throwing anything at me. And I'm happy to take some time to answer some questions. I know we have a few minutes at the end here. If there's anyone who has a question, we have some mics around in the back that we can bring around. But I'd love to take some time to do some Q&A now if anyone has any questions you'd like to ask. If you have a question, go ahead and just raise your hand. Where's the question?
Why aren't you trying to become president again?
Why am I not running for president again? That's a very good question. It's not because I've given up on my vision, and it's not because I ran for president because with every fiber of my being, I want to start a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. When I ran in 2020, the goal of my campaign was to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people actually means all the people. I propose that we go in and edit our Constitution. On my website, I have a draft of the Constitution I've written. I don't change balance of powers. I don't change checks and balances. I remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from it. As you read through the Constitution, again, there's 51 gender-specific male pronouns. I took each of those pronouns and either made them a proper noun or a gender-neutral pronoun. The parts that exclude natives or don't count Africans or count them as three-fifths, I crossed those out. The clause keeping slavery legal in prison, I took that clause out of the 13th Amendment. I actually made the Constitution say what most people think it says anyway. This is still my vision, and I'm still deeply convicted that the best way to get to that is through a national campaign like a run for president. One of the reasons why my campaign failed in 2020 is because I did not run as a Democrat or as a Republican. I ran as an independent. We have a very entrenched two-party system. I thought by running for president it would force the media to cover me more, but literally they would write me out of stories. And the campaigns of the Democrats and Republicans completely ignored me. And so it was very hard for myself and my press team to get stories written about us or to get things out into the media. It was a very, very challenging thing. When I came up on the 2024 election, I looked at the size of my platform, the number of people who were following me on social media, the people I was engaging with, my audiences, and I realized, and this is going to sound really crass, but I wasn't famous enough, right? I couldn't do this running as a Democrat or a Republican. This will only work running as an independent. The largest block of registered voters in the country are independents. That doesn't mean everyone's not a Democrat or Republican. It means they're just undecided or don't want to commit till the very end. But they almost all vote two-party. Even this year, Cornel West, who is much more famous than I am, he's running as an independent. And the Biden campaign strategy to deal with Cornel West, I read their strategy on Cornel West, it was to ignore him. And his platform is probably 4 to 5 times, maybe 10 times bigger than mine. And so I recognize, well, my vision is good. I don't have enough following yet. And so if I were to just run again in 2024, they could have just ignored me again. So part of my goal before 2028 or even 2032 is to, can I grow my audience? So that when I do run, the candidates have to deal with me and the press has to cover me. So that's what I'm working towards, not just trying to become famous, but trying to engage meaningfully within the dialogue so that when I do run again, I can't be ignored. But I appreciate your question. Thanks for asking that.
So it seems like you're swimming upstream a little bit and wondering, where do you see glimmers of actual change, actual hope?
The hope that I get is every time I give a lecture, a presentation, and I get people in the room, and I'm able to present this information, people engage with it. That I have this weird thing every time before I travel, I'm like, oh, I'm not dreading it, but I'm kind of anticipating it with a bit of angst. And every time I come home, I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. I had a lot of great questions, a lot of good dialogue, a lot of good interactions. And I really, really like that. I'm very encouraged every time I get out and engage with people. The hardest part about this work is not communicating with the people who come to these events. It's how do we get people into the room? How do we get people into the room? That's the biggest question I have to deal with. I am a native man talking about the doctrine of discovery. Even if you don't know me or don't know about the doctrine of discovery, that just sounds scary. And so the thing I'm always trying to work with is, how do I get people into the room? What I'm doing right now, I am taking the middle of this lecture, the content on Lincoln, and I'm developing it into a standalone presentation that's going to be about 25% my story as a Navajo man and my people's interaction with Abraham Lincoln. It's going to be about 50 to 60% historical lecture and wrestling with this. And it's going to be about 20%, maybe 25% humor, which sounds weird. But you hear this history, you either have to laugh or have to cry. And so I'm going to I'm good at making people cry, but I want to see if I can bring a little laughter into the room. And I'm developing this, and beginning this year, I'm going to start taking it to audiences around the country. First to closed audiences, and second half of the year to more broad audiences. And my goal in the next year and a half is to get our nation to wrestle with not just who Lincoln was and what he did, but what does it say about us as a nation that we still celebrate him as our greatest leader. And I want to get our country to wrestle with that. And my hope is everybody knows Lincoln, everybody loves Lincoln, and everybody knows enough about Lincoln to know they shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But there's a curiosity there, like, how bad was he really? And I want to try to capitalize on that and see if I can get our nation to talk about Lincoln, and then use that as a stepping stone into the broader dialogue about our history, the doctrine of discovery, and our need for truth and conciliation. But the hope I get comes from my interactions with people like this. One of the things I love, like I said, the silence during the Q&A, that's normal, right? People are kind of stunned with everything I just shared. They're not quite sure what question they want to ask yet. That's normal. The reason I do these book study specials where I give people a virtual Q&A for free if they buy 10 of my signed books from either here or on my website, the reason I do that is because I love the dialogues that happen 4 to 6 months later. So when people read my book and then they have some questions and then they get to jump on a virtual Q&A with me, those are the conversations I live for. Those are the conversations that give me incredible hope, because that's where I see people really deeply wrestling with these issues. Thanks for asking that question. I appreciate that. Any other questions? There's one more here.
So we've had third-party candidates that have carried a lot of weight in the history of this nation. Can it really work? I mean, can our system, the way it is, really work? Obviously, you believe it must be able to. I think we need a new system.
Yeah. So here's the other thing that gives me hope. The stuff I talked to you about with trauma, okay? Understanding who my audience is has been very, very helpful. And something I've learned, right? So the easiest group of people to get into a lecture with me are people of color and white progressives, right? Those are the people who will see the topic and say, oh, I'd like to go hear more about that. Now, some of my most enthusiastic audiences in regards to response to what I've said are white conservatives. Someone who would never self-select to hear me speak. But they come into an event and they don't even know I'm going to be there and they don't know who I am or what I'm going to say until it's too late to leave politely. And those people, once I get them in the room, because I understand their trauma, I understand what's going to make them stand up and scream and what I need to do to keep them in their seats, because I've learned how to help them to hear my lecture, and once they hear it, they can't unhear it, I can actually impact their thinking. So I did a book tour a year and a half ago. I traveled all around the country, did about 25 stops all around the country. My biggest event and my most enthusiastic crowd was in Orange City, Iowa. A stone's throw from where Donald Trump stood on stage and said he could shoot someone in New York City and not lose a single supporter. Right? I was speaking to a white, conservative, Republican crowd, and they loved it. And I let them have it with everything I had. And at the end after I was done, the next day, a professor from one of the colleges nearby wrote an op-ed, and he said, "We were visited by a prophet last night." And so what I've learned I can do, and this is the problem, right, is when you go into these debates, especially people on the conservative Republican side of things, they are hypersensitive to, are you trying to convert me to become a liberal? So when I give a bipartisan critique, and I critique Biden just as hard as I critique Trump, they feel more at peace. Once they know I'm not trying to convert them, then they feel at peace. So when I was in Orange City, Iowa, this was right after the Supreme Court case came out where Christians won the right to pray at the center field of high school football games after the game. Do you remember this case about a year and a half ago? Right? And the conservative Republicans were celebrating this with everything they had. And I heard an interview with the football coach from Seattle, from the West Coast, who was in this case. And they were asking him, right, the school said, hey, you can pray in a classroom before the game, or you can pray, right, in a more secluded place. And in the interview, he said, I'm a Christian who wears my faith on my sleeve. I'm not a Christian who's going to go pray in the closet. That's what he said. And so I said to this audience in Orange City, Iowa, I said, the problem is your party has you celebrating things that don't even align with your faith. I said, you just won the right to piously pray in public after a football game. And the guy who filed the lawsuit said he was someone who wore his faith on his sleeve and wasn't someone who prayed in a closet. I said, let's see what Jesus has to say about this. And I put the quote on the screen where Jesus said, if you want God to hear you, go and pray in your closet, and your God who sees things that are done in secret will reward you. I said, so you are celebrating the fact that the Supreme Court gave you the right to pray in a manner that guarantees your God will not hear you. And you think this is a good thing. And the next day they wrote, we were visited by a prophet last night. So again, if I run as a Democrat, they're never going to listen to me. If I run as a Republican, the Democrats are never going to listen to me. If I run as an independent, I have the best chance of intellectually engaging with people on both sides to get them to really think about what they believe and what they really want, and maybe even get them to think differently or change their mind on some topics. And that's what we need to do, right? White evangelicals know Trump is a sinking ship. They know that. But every time they get pressed on it, they have to double down on their bet. They know they're fighting someone who, or they're supporting someone who doesn't align with their faith. They know that. But because they don't want to get converted to Democrat, they double down every time they get pressed on it. And so this is where I'm trying to be the voice in the middle to say, let's think about what, and so the way I want to get votes is not by just making them hate each other, but by getting them to think, right? I've told this to many people. The reason this book is not a New York Times bestseller, the reason it's not a bestseller is because it makes a bipartisan critique. If we would have just critiqued the left or just critiqued the right, we would have been the top of the sales list. Because we critique both sides. And let me read one of the reviews on the back cover of our book by Mark Knoll, who's a Civil War historian. This is what he wrote. Why should I endorse a book when I do not agree with some of its historical judgments? Answer, for the same reason you should read it. Charles and Ra attack I can't read the word from here, a principle, the doctrine of discovery. They review an evil history, the United States treatment of Native peoples. They challenge a persistent stereotype, American exceptionalism, and psychoanalyze white America in denial about its nation's history. The entire book, even when you think things could be evaluated differently, will make you think and think hard about critically important questions of Christian doctrine, American history, and God's standards of justice. Now, I'm almost positive, this guy's a Civil War historian. I don't know him personally. I'm willing to bet he had problems with chapters 9 and 10 about Lincoln. But because of the way we argued it and laid it out, he's like, holy crap, you made me think about something I never thought about before, and I'm going to recommend this book, even though I don't agree with some of its judgments. I love that. That's the kind of, I want it where I engage with people who are thinking critically, and I want to get the left and the right thinking critically about these things. Because right now we're not. And we're following old white men on both sides of the aisle who can barely stand up themselves, and I'm sure they both have a nap schedule. Right? And we're not thinking critically. And so that's why I'm deeply convinced. And this is why I think Cornel West is having the challenge he's having with his campaign, because even though he's running as an independent finally, he's still a liberal candidate. And he's still largely just catering to the left. And we need someone who can really speak to both sides and get both sides to think critically about who they are and what they want. So that's what I'm working for. Thanks for that question. I appreciate that.
Please help me. Thank you so much. Thank you for helping us think deeply. Some of it was kind of painful. We need it because we want to create common memory. Please help me thank Mark Charles.
Really quickly. I have a lot of books up here that I reference in my speeches. This is Prophetic Lament, written by my co-author, which is a great place for the church to start. This is the book on the Bear River Massacre. This is a great book on more hidden American history. This is another book on the Doctrine of Discovery written by Sarah Augustine, which is a tremendous book. And this is the book on perpetration-induced traumatic stress. I'm going to leave these books up here if you want to come up and take a picture of them or look at them more. I'll also be in the back at my book table to answer questions and to sign and sell books if you want to purchase any.
We have cookies and other wonderful goodies in the community center. Thank you so much. Attendance will go up for those of you who are students here right very soon. Sam's working on it. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you.